What's going on, everybody? Welcome back into the Fantasy Pros YouTube channel. My name is Lucas Wencl, and today we are talking about 10 players that you can look to drop after week 13 of the NFL season to make room for those waiver wire ads ahead of week 14. As always, we'll cover guys both in deep leagues and shallow leagues, but before we dive on into that list, if you want a chance at winning a signed Jackson Smith and Jigba Seahawks helmet for free, courtesy of our friends at pristineauction.com, all you need to do is head to fantasypros.com/contest, complete the form, and either download the Fantasy Pros My Playbook app, leave a review for the podcast, or follow us on X, Instagram, or TikTok at Fantasy Pros. The more actions you complete, the more entries you receive. We'll be announcing a winner right here on the podcast, so if you're watching on YouTube, be sure to subscribe and turn on those notifications so you can be alerted when new episodes are up and to come claim your prize. Kicking off our list this week is San Francisco 49ers wide receiver Ricky Pearsall. Slick Rick made our list last week after giving you back-to-back goose eggs, but he managed to give you another goose egg this week if you kept him rostered. The rookie out of Florida has shown flashes of big play potential, but being the fourth option in this passing attack just doesn't give him enough opportunity. Plus, the schedule isn't exactly kind to 49ers wide receivers coming up. They draw Chicago and Miami in two of their next three games, who are both bottom three in fantasy points per game allowed to wide receivers this year. At this point, Pearsall can be dropped in all league formats for pieces that will round out your roster better as the fantasy playoffs approach. The next player you can look to drop this week is Demario Douglas, wide receiver for the New England Patriots. Look, it's not that Demario Douglas has been bad per se. He's finished as a wide receiver 40 or better in 4 of his last 5 games and is averaging just over 6 targets per game during that stretch. The problem is that this might be the best we get out of Demario Douglas rest of the season. He's only had 2 games with more than 10 fantasy points in PPR formats since week 6, and that week 6 game against the Texans is a massive outlier at this point. We haven't seen him go for more than 62 yards since then. With the fantasy playoffs looming, you may as well stash a handcuff running back or another wide receiver with higher upside. Pop Douglas is purely a floor play at this point in the season, and that doesn't do you much good sitting on the end of your bench. Our next player that you can drop this week is Tyjae Spears, running back for the Tennessee Titans. I wouldn't recommend dropping Spears in the deepest of leagues because he still has handcuff value, but the hope for standalone value has completely evaporated at this point. It makes sense that Spears wouldn't get involved in the run game when he's coming off a concussion, and the Titans were getting absolutely smoked. However, I would have expected more in the receiving game. Spears was targeted 0 times despite the Commanders scoring on each of their first 4 drives of the game. Tony Pollard is clearly the lead back for the Titans, and it's unclear how involved Spears will be moving forward. I'd expect to see him get a bit more work against teams like the Jaguars and Colts coming up, but in this Tennessee Titans offense, that may not amount to much, so you can look to drop him for more reliable or higher upside pieces on your waiver wire. Another wide receiver you can look to drop this week is Quentin Johnston of the Los Angeles Chargers. The problem with Quentin Johnston is that he is 100% undependable. He went on a solid midseason stretch averaging 15 fantasy points per game between weeks 9 through 11, but even during that stretch, it came on the back of 3 touchdowns. He's only had 1 game with more than 50 receiving yards since week 9, and he's caught 2 or less passes in 4 of those 5 games. That's simply not a dependable piece you can count on in your starting lineup at any point, especially with matchups against the Chiefs and the Broncos coming up. If you can't count on QJ when it matters most during the fantasy football season, there's no need for him to be on your roster, so he's another player you can ditch for one of the top waiver wire ads this week. Our next player that you can drop this week is Devin Singletary, running back for the New York Giants. Look, I'm tired of putting Devin Singletary on this list, but somehow he's still rostered in 44% of leagues. Let's just be blunt here. Since week 7, Singletary has only given you 1 game with more than 6 fantasy points. He only has 1 game with more than 35 rushing yards during that stretch, and he's finished as the running back 40 or worse in 5 of those 6 games. This is Tyrone Tracy's backfield. I know Singletary got 7 carries to Tracy's 9 on Thanksgiving, but even if that trend does continue, it only amounted to 2.3 fantasy points. This Giants offense is not good whether it's Tommy DeVito, Drew Lock, or Tim Boyle under center. It's hardly worth stashing Singletary as a handcuff at this point, so I'm in favor of dropping him in the majority of league formats. The next player to consider cutting is Baltimore Ravens wide receiver Diontae Johnson. You and I played just as many snaps and ran just as many routes as Diontae Johnson on Sunday. 0. He did not see the field at all against the Philadelphia Eagles. Rashad Bateman left this game in the 3rd quarter with a knee injury and didn't return. Diontae Johnson still didn't see the field. John Harbaugh had some cryptic comments after the game when asked about Diontae Johnson not seeing the field, saying, quote, "I'm not ready to comment on that right now. I will be, just don't have enough information right now to talk about that," close quote. What that means? I have zero clue. What I do know, though, is that Diontae Johnson has given you a goose egg in 4 of his 5 games with the Ravens so far, and pile on that he's on bye in Week 14, he's droppable in every league format. Up next on our drop list is Tyler Lockett, wide receiver for the Seattle Seahawks. Lockett has now made this list in 3 straight weeks, and the trend I initially forecasted has unfortunately come to fruition. Lockett hasn't seen more than 3 targets in 4 of his last 5 games, and in that other lone game, he only drew 4 targets. He's now finished as the wide receiver 67 or worse in 4 of those 5 games, which makes him completely unrosterable at this point. DK Metcalf is the clear one, Jackson Smith-Njigba is now the established wide receiver 2, and this is the market share Lockett is now stuck with. Similar to Quentin Johnston, Lockett is entirely unreliable at this point, so why hang on to him in any league format? Find a higher upside piece or a handcuff stash on your waiver wire to fill out your roster with the fantasy playoffs looming. Unless you're playing in a 2-quarterback or superflex league, you can look to part ways with Atlanta Falcons quarterback Kirk Cousins. When you put the whole picture together, it honestly hasn't been that great of a fantasy season for Kirk Cousins. He only has 3 finishes inside of the top 15 quarterbacks this year, while finishing as the quarterback 22 or worse in 7 games. On top of that, Kirk has now gone 3 straight games without throwing a touchdown, and there's just not the same zip on the ball coming out of his hands. He does get a revenge game against Minnesota coming next week, but what confidence has Kirk given you that he can survive Brian Flores? At this point in the season, there's no need to roster 2 quarterbacks on your team unless if you have one of the quarterbacks going on bye in Week 14. But even then, you can likely do better than Kirk Cousins. The next cut candidate we're going to talk about is Washington Commanders running back Austin Ekeler. This one is incredibly low-hanging fruit since Ekeler landed on IR over the weekend, but I feel the need to highlight why he should be dropped and not stashed on your IR spot. At the earliest, Ekeler won't be eligible to return until Week 18 because of the team's Week 14 bye, and that's assuming he's fully recovered from his concussion. Majority of fantasy leagues have had their championship in Week 17 to avoid the hassle of NFL playoff teams sitting their starters in Week 18, so it does most leagues no good to keep Ekeler rostered if he can't play at all the rest of the fantasy season. Even if your championship does run through Week 18, I wouldn't bank on Ekeler being back considering how nasty of a bump he took against the Cowboys. Ekeler can be dropped in all league formats with all of this on context, unfortunately. And lastly, you can consider sending Kansas City Chiefs running back Kareem Hunt to the waiver wire this week. This one is for those of you playing in the shallowest of leagues, and it still may be hard to part ways with Kareem Hunt because of the handcuff value being extremely high. That being said, though, the splits on Black Friday against the Raiders definitely didn't favor the veteran back. Hunt was given 9 touches, but struggled for only 15 total yards on the afternoon. Meanwhile, Isaiah Pacheco played just as many snaps, was given 7 carries, and averaged over 6 yards per tote for 44 yards. What's killer for Hunt, though, is that the matchups are dreadful coming up, getting the Chargers, Browns, and Texans in each of their next 3 games, who are all bottom 7 in fantasy points allowed to running backs this year. In deep leagues, you're keeping Kareem Hunt stashed, but in the shallowest of leagues, it's okay to consider dropping Hunt if there's someone like a Jordan Mason available on your waiver wire. Alrighty, y'all, that's it. That's all I've got for you here today, but before we sign off, remember, if you want a chance at winning a signed Jackson Smith-Njigba Seahawks helmet for free, courtesy of our friends at pristineauction.com, all you need to do is head to fantasypros.com/contest, complete the form, and either download the Fantasy Pros My Playbook app, leave a review for the podcast, or follow us on X, Instagram, or TikTok at FantasyPros. The more actions you complete, the more entries you receive. We'll be announcing a winner right here on the podcast, so if you're watching on YouTube, be sure to subscribe and turn on those notifications so you can be alerted when new episodes are up and to come claim your prize when we announce it.